Shabbat, 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 Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat. One more time. Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shalom. Shalom, shalom, shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom, shalom, shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom aleichem. Evenu shalom, shalom, shalom aleichem. Hey.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to Pride Shabbat. It's so nice to have everybody here. Everybody likes your the fact that you're facing them.
Well, you know, when the piano comes out of the hospital, maybe we'll have me facing them.
It's kind of hard with one of those giant classical deals to do this.
Well, they used to do it with
sing-along thing.
The pianist used to face the audience until Franz Liszt came along, and he.
Really?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, Brahm. Yeah. He ruins everything. That's what we used to say. That Brahm guy ruins everything. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for those of you who are joining us as guests. Thank you to the members who are here tonight. We're looking very, very much forward to hearing from Dr. RETZLOFF the stories that he has to tell about early queer liberation in our area, in our state. But before we do that, we are going to have our little Shabbat service here, our humanistic Shabbat service, and I'm sure some of you who don't know what that is are going to find out. And those of you who do know what that is, I hope that you'll find that we meet the standard. Our readers tonight are drawn from our members and their loved ones, Deanne Safer, Barry Safer, Ruth Kadish, Lonnie Fleischer, Fran Shore, and Barbara Logan, who are also sponsoring our Shabbat tonight, our Oneg Shabbat tonight, so please join us. That's what we really, aside from the speaker and the brilliance of the speakers and the presentations, it's really the cake that we come for. So that'll be out these doors and to your right as you leave. So thank you to Fran and Barbara for doing that. And it's in honor of your mom and dad who...
Actually, it's their yard site tonight, both of them.
It's their yard site?
And it's just lovely together because they were co-owners of a drag queen show bar in Detroit in the 1980s called the Pink Flamingo.
Oh. Wow. The Pink Flamingo Show Bar. The Pink Flamingo Show Bar. Thank you. Thank you for sponsoring. Those of you who don't know, Yahrzeit is the anniversary of someone's death, and in our Jewish tradition, we observe that as a way of, on an annual basis, a way of remembering them. Okay, we're going to begin. Arthur, if you will. Arthur's usually in the back, and now he's up front because we had a special arrangement for the audio visual. We're going to start with this reading and then light our candles. We come together this Shabbat, each bringing with us a private world of hopes, of fears, of dreams. Some of us are burdened by anxieties and cares that all but crash our hope in the future. Others have hearts filled with happiness, grateful for the joys of the past week, yet aware that even the most fortunate are vulnerable before the mystery of tomorrow. Every life is a unique blending of joy and sorrow, of fulfillment and frustration. But beneath our uniqueness, we are all bound together by our common humanity. All of us deeply yearn to know true freedom and peace. Each of us seeks the personal liberation of a mind that is not enslaved to conventional wisdom, a heart that is able to love without fear, a spirit that cries yes to our potential. Each of us strives, too, for the inner peace that comes with finding a harmony between our aspirations and our abilities. This is the Shabbat peace to which we aspire. I'd like to call upon the Arking family, John, Carolyn, and Ari, to light our Shabbat candles.
May the doors of our community be wide enough to receive all who hunger for love, all who are lonely for friendship. May they welcome all who have cares to unburden, gratitude to experience, hopes to nurture. May the doors of our community be narrow enough to shut out pettiness and pride, envy and enmity. May their threshold be no stumbling block for young or unsure feet. May they be too high to admit complacency, selfishness, and harshness. May this congregation be, for all who enter, the doorway to a richer and more meaningful life.
Mishkanoteka Yisrael, Ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkanoteka Yisrael, Likrat Shabbat, lechu v'nelcha, lechu v'nelcha. Mekor habracha, ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanoteka Yisrael. Ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanoteka
As we gather on this Pride Shabbat, may each of us recognize the unique treasure that is every single human life. May we read together our hearts with full and true support of each other. May we embrace ourselves and each other openly, proudly, and joyfully.
May we
May we locate and offer ourselves and one another the courage, strength, and compassion to live with integrity and authenticity. And may we open our eyes to the gifts and blessings we offer and receive from each other.
Lechuneranena, lechuneranena, lechuneranena la Shabbat. Lechuneranena, lechuneranena, lechuneranena la Shabbat. Naria, naria, leyom simchatenu, nekadma v'shalom. Naria, naria, leyom simchatenu, Biasmirot nagialo. Lechuneranena, lechuneranena, lechuneranena la Shabbat. Lechuneranena, lechuneranena, lechuneranena la Shabbat. You'll have to use the other stairway. You'll have to use the other stairway.
I'm so sorry, Ruth. We did not plan properly for this. Arthur, push it forward
Sorry.
just a bit. And with pride, Ruth Kadish takes the bimah.
One day, the words coming out will sound strange. Oppression based on gender or orientation will be a memory. The pain of hiding, repressing, denying, history to honor and remember. Honoring the triumphs of those who fought to be free. Remembering the violence and vitriol that cost lives. Should love win at long last, then the lessons of love your neighbor as yourself will be as natural as breathing. And one day, love can win every heart. Love can win every soul. Fear can vanish like smoke, and tenderness for all can fill our hearts. Love can win. In the end, love can absolutely win. Man for man, woman for woman, woman for man, man for woman, human for human. All genders, all orientations, all true attachments of the heart. Let this come speedily in our day, a tribute to the many and the diverse, a tribute to love, deep and true, each of us for each other. Now, how do I go back?
Past Arthur, he moved the table.
Amar Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Akiva, ve'ahavta l'reacha, l'reacha kamocha, ze klal gadol, gadol b'Torah, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Akiva, ve'ahavta l'reacha, l'reacha kamocha, ze klal gadol, gadol b'Torah, Amar Rabbi Akiva.
Wow, good crowd. Shabbat Shalom. I love it. Our humanistic philosophy insists that we all work to end inequality, injustice, and violence. Today, more than ever before, our movement lifts up the LGBTQ+ community to ensure freedom from fear. In that spirit, this year's humanistic Jewish role model is Harvey Milk, an iconic queer rights activist, California's first openly gay elected official, lost to an assassin in 1978. Wherever Harvey Milk went, he wore a button that said, "I am all of us," an excerpt from a poem he wrote during his fight against California's proposed ban on queer educators. This is his poem. I am all of us. I can be killed with ease, I can be cut right down, but I cannot fall back to my closet. I have grown. I am not myself. I am too many. I am all of us.
תקוותי, תקוותי בי, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך. Where is my light? My light is you and in you.
The Talmud teaches all who can protest against some wrong committed by their family and do not are accountable together with their family. All who can protest against some wrong committed by a citizen of their city and do not are accountable together with all citizens of the city. All who can protest against some wrong committed by the whole world and do not are accountable together with all citizens of the world.
Let us honor the resilience, struggles, celebrations, and pride of the LGBTQ+ community. Let us take inspiration from them and others to fight for the lives of all of our fellow citizens. Let us do so through supporting each other, honoring, love, respecting the dignity of every person, resisting tyranny, voting, and protesting, our favorite. For the sake of all those who suffer oppression, let us stand up for peace and equality.
נפתח לנו שערי צדק, חן וחסד ורחמים. נפתח לנו שערי צדק, חן וחסד ורחמים. זה השלום, נפתח לנו ונבובם. זה השלום, נפתח לנו ונבובם. נפתח לנו שערי צדק, חן וחסד ורחמים.
the merger poem. And then all that has divided us will merge. And then compassion will be wedded to power. And then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. And then both men and women will be gentle. And then both men and women will be strong. And then no person will be subject to another's will. And then all will be rich and free and varied. And then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance. And then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old. And then all will nourish the young. And then all will cherish life's creatures. And then all will live in harmony with each other and the earth. And then everywhere will be called Eden once again. Judy, Chicago.
Na'aseh shalom, shalom ba'olam. Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Na'aseh shalom, shalom ba'olam. Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom.
In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, we extend our well wishes to these members of our community and to their loved ones, to Judy Freund, Ruthie Goldman, Ruth Moltz, Mary Monahan, Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, and Jim Walker. If there's someone whom you're thinking about to whom you'd extend with our congregation well wishes as we go around the room, please do. Anybody on this side? Yes, Miriam.
Robert Howard.
Thank you. Anybody else on this side that we missed? Over here? In the back? May all who suffer know that they are not alone, that we are there. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies, and the renewal of their spirits. Mekom ha'koach betocheinu, mekorot ha'bracha mikevrotenu. May the source of strength that dwells so deep within us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Shalom. Mekom ha'koach betocheinu, mekorot ha'bracha mikevrotenu. May those in need of healing know refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Shalom. On this day, We remember our LGBTQ plus siblings who have died because of who they were, those murdered by fanatics long ago, those who perished along with our people in the Holocaust, those who suffered at the hands of evil regimes, and those who have been struck down in our own towns and cities in our own times. We remember, too, those who died at their own hands, driven to despair by a world that hated them because of their love or gender identities. With hearts turned toward compassion, we also remember those who lived lives of loneliness, repressing their true natures and refraining from sharing their love with one another. As we remember the sacrifice of so many who were martyred to the hatred and rejection of others, let us strive to bring an end to hate and to oppression of every kind. Joseph.
There are stars up above, so far away we only see their light. Long after the star itself is gone. And so it is with people that we love. Their memories keep shining ever brightly, though their time with us is done. But the stars that light up the darkest night, these are the lights that guide us as we live our days. These are the ways we remember. We remember as we live our days. These are the ways we remember. We remember. In addition to those whom we have just recalled, our thoughts turn also to all of those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight, we observe the yahrzeits of these members of our community and their loved ones, of Lucille Arking, Benjamin Dennenberg, Paul Kadish, Jerome Logan, Marilyn Ann Logan, Abraham Meisner, Irving Pinkney, Cecile Plafkin, Belle Radner, Maurice Rose, and Milton A. Vidra. If there's someone whom you're remembering tonight, as we did earlier for those who were ill, please share. Thank you, Cindy. Anybody else on this side? Fran? Miriam? John? Did we miss anyone at all? Yes, Marty. Anybody else that we missed? We say, Yehi Zichram Livracha. May their memories provide us with blessing, by which we mean that as we go through this land and this world and this life in their absence, we hope that those small memories and large ones of joy that we shared will provide us with some sense of comfort. If you can do so comfortably, please rise, as together we will recite our humanistic interpretation of the Kaddish. Nit gadal v'nit kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us proclaim the preciousness of life Let us show gratitude of life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. So while Arthur and I get the presentation ready for Dr. RETZLOFF, we're going to turn it over to Joseph, who you already know can bring down the house with his music, who's going to sing us a song about pride and, I don't know, being who you are, right?
All that stuff. So you might recognize this. It's from that hit musical, La Cage aux Folles. I am what I am. I am my own special creation. So come take a look. Give me the hook or the ovation. It's my world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say, hey world, I am what I am. I am what I am. I don't want praise, I don't want pity. I bang my own drum. Some think it's noise, I think it's pretty. And so what if I love each feather and each bangle? Why not try to see things from a different angle? Your life is a sham till you can shout out loud, I am what I am. I am what I am, and what I am needs no excuses. I deal my own deck, sometimes the ace, sometimes the deuces. It's one life, and there's no return and no deposit. One life, so it's time to open up the closet. Life's not worth a damn till you can shout, hey, we're Woo!
So tonight, of course, we're here at this part of our evening to welcome the leading expert in the history of queer liberation in Michigan, and I presume one of the leading experts in the history of queer liberation in the world, Dr. Tim RETZLOFF. Dr. RETZLOFF received his BA degree with highest honors from the University of Michigan in 2006, going on to earn his PhD in history at Yale in 2014. His dissertation examined how prior to graduation school, Dr. RETZLOFF worked for 17 years in various University of Michigan libraries, beginning on the Flint campus and then in Ann Arbor. His engagement with UM's LGBTQ+ past was sparked during those days, beginning while he was still a student at UM Flint, which is also the city in which he grew up. And he authored the history appendix for a 1991 study entitled From Invisibility to Inclusion, Opening the Doors for Lesbians and Gay Men at the University of Michigan. It's commonly known, and some of you have heard of it, as the Lavender Report. He's also the former editor of Between the Lines, Michigan's LGBTQ newspaper, which you can pick up everywhere, and I'm sure everyone has seen at some point. Today, Dr. RETZLOFF teaches LGBTQ studies and United States history at Michigan State University. His scholarly articles have appeared in a large variety of journals, His scholarship has also received acclaim in a very special graphic novel, a comic book, if you will, called Come Out in Detroit. There are free copies for everybody back there, on which he collaborated with illustrator Isabel Claire Paul. Dr. RETZLOFF is a popular and in-demand speaker, as you can imagine, on LGBTQ history, especially during this time of year. And for that reason, I'm especially grateful that he could take the time to celebrate Pride Shabbat with us tonight. Please welcome Dr. Tim RETZLOFF. And then just that should do it.
All right. Check the time, okay, and check, all right. Good? Okay, hi everyone. I would like to first thank Rabbi Jeff and Arthur for the kind invitation to speak with you here today, and also to Fran Shore and Barbara Logan for sponsoring the Shabbat and apparently the cake that we're going to have. So this is a somewhat informal talk. It's based on a talk that I've given several times. I haven't given it this year yet, but it's Shockwaves from Stonewall. It's kind of focused on the gay liberation period of Michigan. It kind of saw its kernel, its germination in a feature article I did for Between the Lines in 2019 for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. If anyone's interested in the text of the article, which will be different from what I'm saying tonight, there'll be some crossover. I'd be happy to send you a PDF of that. To kind of set the stage a little bit before I dive into kind of gay liberation in Michigan and in Detroit, the 1940s and 50s in the United States were a period that historians have come to call the Lavender Scare. So many of you are probably familiar with the Red Scare, in which communists were kind of targeted in the federal government and purged from their jobs. And it's probably the case that more people lost their jobs because of homosexuality or bisexuality, because they were perceived to be what we might today call queer, then lost their jobs for communism. So then Roy Cohn and Joe McCarthy, who were key to the Red Scare, were also front and center with the Lavender Scare. And this had local ramifications as well. Here in Detroit, people were subject to arrest. There were harsh criminal laws that people faced, so there were police surveillance of public areas where gay men cruised, various bars. Prophet Jones, who was a local African-American religious leader, was arrested on a morals charge when an officer of the vice squad was planted in his flock. And you can see from the headline on the Free Press just how big of a story this was locally. And those of you old enough to remember singer Johnny Ray. Johnny Ray was also arrested in Detroit in an undercover situation at a bar. And this kind of localized version of the Lavender Scare also saw its way to college campuses, in which students and staff and professors were arrested for cruising on campus. There were key nationally known crackdowns at the University of Michigan and also at Michigan State. The document on the left is actually a police report where a student at Michigan State was arrested and then pressed to name names. So just to kind of give you a sense of how harsh things were. So it was criminal, it was considered a mental illness. It was, most religious denominations condemned it as a sin. But not to paint too bleak of a picture, because people that now fall under the umbrella of LGBTQ+ managed to find each other during this time. And particularly in larger cities, there was kind of a rich flourishing of gay bar life, particularly working class bar lives in San Francisco and in New York, the Scenic Bar in Toledo, Dixie's in New Orleans, and the Acme Bar in San Antonio. but also here in Michigan. So the 1011, which was on Farmer Street downtown, and the Palais, which was, kind of the roughest kind of lesbian bar, was known as the Pit, was down on Farmer Street. The Hotel Wentworth in Lansing, the State Bar in Flint, and the Blue Tempo Bar in Saugatuck were all kind of bars that were part of the nightlife before Stonewall. And I'll get to Stonewall in just a second. Now, there was still, even within the gay community at the time, there was rampant racism going on. So a lot of these bars blatantly excluded African Americans from visiting. And so to kind of counter that and to kind of provide a space, this network of house parties, particularly the house parties that were hosted by Ruth Ellis and her partner Ceceline Babe Franklin in their home on Oakland, became kind of a rich gathering place for members of the African American community in Detroit and Easter and River Rouge, and some of them came as far as Flint to kind of gather and kind of forge a community there, and it was kind of a safe haven. And also there was kind of this tradition that emerged by the late 40s of a drag culture. And oftentimes this is the precursor, if you've heard of the ballroom scene. This goes back, at least to the 20s, and really saw a flourishing in the late 40s and early 50s, such that the Michigan Chronicle at the time was covering some of these instances. To give you a sense that that this kind of history is still being excavated, these are a couple of photos that that my husband and I got on eBay in the last 4 or 5 years, and it's of the drag ball of 1946 here in Detroit. So we don't know much about who these people are. They're signed with their performing names, but there's still stuff we can glean from this. We can glean that that they drew an audience, that they that they came together, that they were there, they were part of the community. This is also a period, if you've heard of Christine Jorgensen, this was a period when, nationally, the idea that there could be sex change and kind of very much in the binary of the 1950s, that someone who felt that they were not in the body that they should be in. Christine Jorgensen had served as a GI, was kind of nationally known figure. So this was kind of an early inching out of what we would now include under the umbrella of trans. And so, there's some ways in which Christine Jorgensen conformed to kind of gender norms, but there's also ways in which she certainly defied gender norms. And she became a nightclub performer and performed here in Dearborn, Michigan, in one of her sites. There's also kind of the early incarnation of what historians have come to call the homophile movement. So there was early resistance. There were early efforts to kind of push back against this. Now, it was also very hesitant, and some people kind of frame these people as pursuing respectability or assimilation, but they were still, for their time and considering the risks that people were put under, they were, pushing the envelope as much as they could. And this included the publication of One magazine, and you can see from an issue from their first year, August of 1953, they were already contemplating the idea of marriage. And there were also pickets, very, very respectable pickets of Independence Hall from 1965 to 69, in which they kind of pushed the envelope of visibility more than it had been. And this is not just nationally, but locally there were efforts. The earliest that has come to light is a chapter of the Mattachine Society called the Detroit Area Council of the Mattachine Society. This is Hal Lawson and David Brewer, both Detroiters, both World War II vets, and they formed a chapter that lasted from August of 1958, excuse me, to March of 1960. And it's notable because they had a newsletter, they did have some gatherings, but they really never had more than maybe a dozen people that were actively involved for any one time. The secretary, you know, when he wrote to, you know, the national organization to say that they had disbanded, that they were dissolving, he said he wasn't sure if it was you know, the people involved or the flighty Detroit populace. And that was Jerry Abraham Moore, who later became a disciple of Rabbi Wine. So I'll just kind of give a shout out to Lady J, as he was known. There was also a group called One in Detroit, which was affiliated with One magazine. This was formed in late 1965 by a Grosse Pointe travel agent named Chet Sampson, who had been a school teacher and then went on to form a travel agency. And this was actually the first lasting organization. It lasted actually through 1977. And there was kind of, by the time gay lib folk came along, there was kind of a generational rift and there was kind of a political rift. So One was kind of the conservative group that survived into the post-Stonewall era. The other thing that I kind of, gems that it's lovely to find in the archive is from the Labadie collection at the University of Michigan. This is a flyer for Gay Day at Cedar Point in June of 1969. This is 2 weeks before the Stonewall uprising. So Stonewall is this kind of pivotal event in the LGBTQ plus movement. There's controversy because people think that that's where everything started, and it's not where everything started, but it was certainly hugely important. In part, so in a nutshell, a bar called the Stonewall in Greenwich Village, New York, illegal bottle club, was raided. It was kind of a routine police raid, but one particular night in June 1969, the patrons, which many of them were like street youth, it was a go-go boy bar, so there was kind of that going on. It was a place where many people of color, so African American and Hispanic, queer people gathered, people again that we would now call trans. At the time they were called oftentimes hair queens or street queens or transsexuals were also gathering there. So it was kind of a wide mix of people. And, you know, in response to the police raid, they fought back. And they fought back pretty violently. This is also kind of on the heels of the 1960s when there's kind of the volatility going on. There's kind of the models of Black power. There's the models of the free speech movement at Berkeley. There's the model of the anti-war movement. Feminism is kind of gearing up into its second wave. So that's kind of part of the context of what's going on. The other thing is it's in New York, the media capital of the country, and so word got out. So, you know, what might have been kind of an ordinary kind of night of resistance and pushing back actually reverberated. And so, you know, hence the title of my talk, Shockwaves of Stonewall. And the immediate shockwave was that it inspired the formation of the Gay Liberation Front in New York. Within weeks, they started gathering in New York. And gay liberation was much more militant than the earlier homophile movement. It was much more visible and appealed to a new wave of activists. Now remember, this is kind of as the first years of the baby boom are coming of age, so they're also kind of part of this shift. They were also very much in your face with their activism, and it was the kind of fervor, the kind of strongest fervor of gay liberation only lasted really till 73, 74. Part of it had to do with the winding down of the war. Part of it had to do with discouragement over the re-election of Richard Nixon. Part of it had to do with, people just kind of becoming burnt out by kind of the constant pushing back. But one of the lasting legacies was that during gay liberation, activists secured the removal of homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The American Psychiatric Association had deemed homosexuality to be a mental illness, and because of pressure and because of, pioneering research by people like Evelyn Hooker, the American Psychiatric Association rethought it and kind of removed sexual orientation from its list of disorders. So it's kind of one of the major achievements. So the other thing is, gay liberation wasn't just isolated to the largest cities and the coastal cities of the country, but really spread across the United States. So that you see it, certainly large chapters, well, they're really not chapters because Gay Liberation Front didn't believe in chapters. They were kind of affiliated groups. But they also emerged on college campuses and that. And in Detroit, the Gay Liberation Front started in January of 1970 in response to one of the members putting an ad in the Fifth Estate. So this is, I'm a firm believer in kind of letting and wanting to hear directly from the people involved in this history as much as we can. And so this is from an interview segment that Jim Toy gave that touches on how he became involved in the Detroit Gay Liberation Front.
I was typing up the Sunday church bulletin in December of 1969, and on the calendar, I see a note that says gay meeting. So I go to the priest, the third radical priest. We called him Daddy-O. And said, Daddy-O, what is this gay meeting thing? And he said, he was a great big guy with a big deep voice. I don't know what it is. One of the guys in the draft resistance group said, could we have a gay meeting here? And I said, well, whatever that is, if we can't have a gay meeting here, we might as well shut this God box down. So I said, thank you, from the depths of my closet. I go back to typing. I get done. I drive back to Ann Arbor. I immediately run down to the gay body. John, there's something very strange going on at the God box. What? A gay meeting. What's that? Well, we didn't know. There never had been in Michigan an open, above ground advertised, quote, gay meeting. Are we going to go? Oh. And we ambivalated about that for a month. We get together. Are we going to go? Yes, no. So the night before the meeting, we get together at the bar. Are we going to go to this meeting? And we looked at each other and simultaneously said, if we go, that means we're gay. Well, the next day, by karma or whatever, we get into John's car and we drive into the meeting. There we find a dozen other women and men just as excited and scared and confused as we were.
So among the things that the Gay Liberation Front of Detroit ended up doing was staging a protest against the Episcopal Diocese at their annual convention when the bishop kicked them out of their church meeting place. They launched a newspaper called The Gay Liberator, which lasted until 1976. They engaged in protests against the police. This is a cold day in January 1971 at the Murphy Hall of Justice. And they influenced, and Jim Toy in particular, who lived in Ann Arbor but was organist at St. Joseph's Church in Detroit, helped form the Gay Liberation Front in Ann Arbor. And immediately they were kind of doing battle with the highest administration of the university when President Robin Fleming did not want them to meet on campus. He thought that the legislators wouldn't like that. Within a year and a half, Jim Toy and Cindy Gare, who was a member of the Radical Lesbians, had secured paid positions with the university, the first paid positions and the first office geared towards LGBTQ population on campus. So this was kind of a landmark moment in national history, as was the coming out of Jerry DeGreek and Nancy Weschler, who were elected in 1972 on the Human Rights Party in Ann Arbor, and then ended up coming out in 1973 as being openly gay and lesbian while they were on city council in Ann Arbor. While they were on city council, they secured one of the earliest ordinances in the country that protected people on the basis of sexual orientation. And then in 1974, Kathy Kozachenko, also running on the Human Rights Party, was elected as an out lesbian. So even as a candidate, she was out, and this was kind of, she's now noted as the first openly LGBTQ person to be elected to public office in the country. So there's also, during this period of gay liberation, there was who wrote several really important pieces in the Gay Liberator. The Gay Liberation Front in Ann Arbor actually picketed the Flame Bar because they wouldn't allow transvestites to gather there. And kind of in terms of statewide activism, there was an effort, there was a bill called the Traxler Bill that sought to decriminalize sodomy in the state. And gay liberation activists from various cities and towns and campuses actually protested against the Traxler Bill because it did not address cross-dressing or transvestism as it was understood at the time. So in addition to kind of spreading across the country, there was really a key spread of gay liberation and the spread of gay activism on campuses throughout the state. So we get the first gay liberation state. This is a picture of the gay liberation movement at Michigan State. For them, Gay Liberation Front was too radical, so they were kind of accommodating and say, well, we'll be the movement. And they also had kind of contention with the highest administration, who prohibited them from flying a Gay Pride Week banner at the Abbott Road entrance in 1972. And they went through the mechanisms of campus judiciary and secured the right to fly it in 1973. They were also kind of front and center in a major anti-war mobilization in East Lansing that shut down Grand River for 3 days. And I just kind of love this photographic evidence of them spraying gay power as a Michigan State trooper kind of just sits there. I don't know if he's exhausted or bewildered or what, but there's also a chapter of the Gay Liberation Front, or a group of the Gay Liberation Front at Wayne State that emerged in 1971, notably held some dances, notably also set up this gay fruit cart to sell apples on campus. And they sold apples to help raise funds for Christopher Street, Detroit 72, which was, in Michigan, the first kind of major celebration of gay pride in Michigan. So the first anniversary of Stonewall, there were pride celebrations, these Christopher Street celebrations held in New York instead of the annual reminder at Independence Hall that drew thousands. But also there was a similar pride celebration, not as many in number, that was held in Los Angeles, Christopher Street West, and Chicago. So already the first year after Stonewall, there are pride celebrations to remember that event and commemorate that event and embrace it as an important thing to remember. So in late 1971, one of the members of MCC Detroit, Gay Whiteside, who had was also the facilitator of the Daughters of Bilitis. She was kind of upset that Detroit hadn't had any kind of pride event, so she kind of got the ball rolling. And so this was held in June of 1972, in part around the opening of the Green Carnation Community Center, which was on Virginia Park. And so they managed to get a lane of Woodward Avenue and drew from 200 to 400 people, and then had a rally at the old Kennedy Square down at Woodward in Michigan, and had a series of speakers. Got lots of coverage in the press. And Susan Swope, who was married at the time, but had been coming out as lesbian within the feminist community and also within gay liberation, was one of the speakers. She was actually the only woman to speak at the march. And this is from an oral history I did with Susan, describing her memories, or a bit of her memories of her experience.
I remember when we were planning this march, I delivered a speech. And I remember, as I was anticipating giving this speech, thinking, you know, this speech could be on TV. And Michael's parents could see me on TV. And that's how Michael's parents would find out that I'm a lesbian. But I thought, you know, I just have to do it. It's important. And if that happens, it happens. And I remember standing up there and delivering that speech and being really nervous. But, of course, in the event, what got on TV was the drag queens. That's who always gets on TV when you have a gay march.
So one of the other speakers, and the only African-American person to speak at this rally, at this event, was Ken Dudley, who was a key figure early on. And this is a reading of his remarks, his speech from that day by A. Zaire Kwabena, who some of you may know as Curtis Lipscomb, who's the executive director of LGBT Detroit. Ken Dudley died in 1991 of HIV and AIDS complications. So Zaire has recreated the speech from the text that was published in The Liberator. For some reason, it's not, and I don't have the text of the speech. All right. Continue on. And I'll tell you in just a second. So there was also a dance held that night at the First Unitarian Church on Cass near Wayne. And the next day there was a gay be-in or big picnic that was held in Palmer Park. And I particularly love this photo of the women who were there to play softball. I love the softball mitt, because I've interviewed lots of gay men about this time period, and they don't remember women being involved. And this is, you know, just kind of as tangible evidence as you can get that, yes, women were there as well. So last year was the 50th anniversary of Christopher Street, Detroit 72, and my friend Isabel Paul and I, as one of our COVID lockdown projects, decided that not enough people knew about this event. Actually, very few people who weren't there knew about the event. And so we created this comic book called Come Out in Detroit, which is available for everyone to take if you haven't taken one. Ken Dudley's speech, at least part of it, is quoted in here, so you'll get a sense of what he was saying at the march. we got some grassroots funding, and we got a Michigan Humanities Grant. And last year, my Pride Month was kind of devoted to distributing them. So we were at Pride. We had more than 20,000 copies that have been distributed. And right now, we're working on getting them into libraries where they belong. So also in this mix, and kind of an outgrowth, because some people who were involved in one in Detroit, and then other people who were involved in the Gay Liberation Front, the Christian caucus, began to meet. And at one point, they heard an LP of a vinyl record of Reverend Troy Perry, who had formed the Metropolitan Community Church in Los Angeles, with a special outreach to the gay community. So they listened to this record and decided that they wanted to form a Detroit church as well. And MCC last fall celebrated its 50th anniversary as a church. And among the things that they were involved with early on was in June of 1973, there was this horrendous hate crime where a gay bar in New Orleans, the Upstairs Lounge, where the MCC Church of New Orleans had met, was burned, and like 39 people lost their lives, including someone who was originally from Detroit, and his family had rejected him. And MCC Detroit actually held a memorial and raised $800 to send down to New Orleans. And then Ken Dudley, by late 1973, helped form what is among the first formal organizations for Black queer folks, in response to a series of murders of Black men who were apprehended leaving gay bars. They started a group called the Black Association for Gays. And this was kind of the earliest documented organization specifically for people of color in Detroit. There's also a radio program called Gaily Speaking that was launched in September 1973 on WDET, lasted until 1981, and it's just kind of one of the most amazing sources. And I actually, when I teach LGBTQ studies, my students, I have them listen to the first episode, which is all about coming out. And there's kind of this immediacy to them hearing these voices. So it's almost like it's yesterday and not 50 years ago. So kind of backing up a bit, John D'Amelio, a nationally renowned historian, has kind of framed what happened after Gay Lib and kind of the legacy of Gay Lib as following two broad strands. One is that the women kind of went their own way, their separate way in some ways, and focused on culture and sisterhood. And gay men were a little more involved in kind of pursuing politics and sex. So in terms of what was going on among women and lesbians, this kind of sees its formation early on with a statement that Betty Friedan, one of the founders of NOW, said that she was worried about too many lesbians being involved in NOW, that they would be a lavender menace because then everyone would associate NOW with lesbians. And so a number of 20 women kind of infiltrated this early Congress for women in New York in 1970 and kind of staged it to where the lights went off, and then they came back up, and they had these women wearing Lavender Menace t-shirts all around the auditorium, and they demanded to be heard, and they were given a hearing, and they were kind of ultimately embraced as part of the women's movement, and there was no longer quite the distancing. Don't want to sugarcoat it too much, but it was kind of a major step. And some of these women formed a group called the Radical Lesbians with a very famous statement called the Woman Identified Woman, kind of a manifesto or a womanifesto, that the opening is very famous. What is a lesbian? A lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion. And then, you know, a radical lesbian group formed in East Lansing. There was one that formed early on in Ann Arbor. Gail Rubin was involved in that early on. And then this is Cindy Gare, who was the other person hired with Jim Toy to form what's now the Spectrum Center at U of M. And she describes going to her first radical lesbian meeting. I really want you to hear that.
I guess it hit a volume button though.
Yeah.
I think that might have been what happened.
All right, let's try this again.
No. I'm so sorry. We really worked hard to get this to work too. Everything's on the way we said.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I don't understand it at all. It's on here too. Everything's on. I must have blown a fuse.
I will get Rabbi Jeff the audio of both Ken Dudley and Cindy Gare's remarks. There was also a group, a commune that formed in East Lansing called the Purple Peril. This was kind of spreading, and the group that had started, you know, people from around the state had come together to do the events for Pride Week. It was called the Michigan Gay Confederation. And at some point in late 72, 73, the women kind of got fed up with how they were treated. And they said, the sisters from Ann Arbor, Lansing, East Lansing, Grand Rapids, and Detroit are unified in their strong convictions about protecting women's rights within this confederation. We are not going to allow men to ignore our constituency. We can see no future in this confederation as long as sexist attitudes continue to exist. And so after this, for some time, there was a rift. And women in Detroit formed a group called Sophos Sisters Rising. There was the opening of Hershelf Bookstore in Highland Park. There was the opening of a women's bookstore in Ann Arbor. A magazine that's still being published was started in Lansing in 1974 called Lesbian Connection. And then in Ann Arbor, there was a group called the Leaping Lesbian Collective, which started a publication called The Leaping Lesbian. And then also in Detroit, music became a big venue, music and poetry. And for a short time, there was a coffee house called Poor Women's Paradise that gathered in 1975. And these were all kind of precursors and fed into what became known as the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which had a 40-year run and served as a really important site for women and lesbians to come together, but not without, you know, some problematic history. And I also want to acknowledge the problematic history in terms of them excusing trans women from their venue. But for 1976, it really was kind of a major turning point. And then on the other piece of kind of where lesbians were kind of most visible, certainly suburban lesbians were most visible, were in child custody cases in the 1970s. And this is a protest outside the Oakland County Courthouse in 1978, having to do with a custody battle. So in terms of men, the Gay Liberation Front nationally, those groups, and certainly the one in New York, had kind of shifted gears, and there was a breakoff group called the Gay Activist Alliance, which was going to devote itself to gay-only politics and concerns, which meant that kind of all of the intersectionality, all of the kind of appreciation of class and gender and race and how all these things came together and couldn't be separated, that was kind of thrown out the window. So GAA kind of survived on, and then some of those members helped form what became the National Gay Task Force, now the National LGBT Task Force in 1973. In Detroit, voters in November of 1973 enacted a new city charter that included protections based on sexual preference. This was kind of in the founding document of the city that also made the strong mayor system possible, also elected Coleman Young as mayor. It took another 5 years for this ordinance to be passed, but it passed kind of in a very volatile time. This is Brian McNaught, who sought to use the city charter when he was relieved of his post as a columnist for the Michigan Catholic. And hopefully the audio, we'll see how the audio works on this.
Brian McNaught, for 4 years, was a columnist for the Weekly Michigan Catholic, but he is no longer. He was removed from that column and reassigned to other staff work on July 8th, 2 days after coming out publicly through an article by Nancy Manser, which appeared in the Detroit News. The news article described local religious groups oriented toward gays, and Brian was interviewed as president of Detroit's chapter of Dignity, a group for gay Catholics. The action taken against Brian McNaught by the Michigan Catholic occurred quite clearly because he is gay, and more important, because he dared to come out publicly. Officially, said his editor, Margaret Cronin, "We'll say that we're dropping your column because of space limitations, but I know you want me to be honest with you, and it's just too controversial." Later, she described his column as morally unacceptable and detrimental to the well-being of the paper. But now here's Brian to describe himself, his response to this attack.
I told her immediately that I would fight her on it, that she didn't have grounds to do it. Her reaction was that as editor she had the right to drop anything out of the paper that she wanted to, and I said no, that I felt the new city charter protected people because of their sexual orientation, and that was clearly why she was doing it, and that I had a witness.
So kind of in the same vein of becoming more mainstream, also more less politically to the left. David Crumroy kind of emerged as a key figure in this time. He's notable for having a same-sex commitment ceremony with his partner Bill at the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit in '77. He helped launch the Metro Gay News, which was a more liberal paper than leftist radical paper than the Liberator had been. It also covered the bar scene much more richly in kind of political developments more than the Liberator had, including kind of exploring topics such as gays and their relationship to faith, and notably Rabbi Wine was one of the people featured on the front page of this issue in October 1976. David Crumroy was also deeply involved in founding an organization called the Association of Suburban People, which I'll note has no mention of queer, gay, anything, you know, as benign as you can get, but also no mention of Detroit. So you would not know that this was the Detroit queer organization. And yet it became, you know, after gay liberation, it became kind of the most important kind of move forward in terms of kind of people meeting and gathering. And then comes Anita Bryant in June of 1977. And Anita Bryant, in response to the enactment in Miami-Dade County of a human rights ordinance that included sexual orientation protections, She launched a campaign for the repeal of that ordinance, a successful campaign for the repeal of that ordinance, a successful campaign that she called Save Our Children. So, you know, this had reverb across the country. They ended up repealing ordinances in Wichita and Eugene, Oregon, and St. Paul, Minnesota. And people in Michigan, including Stuart Itzkowitz, in his diary, writes, oh, you know, when he sees this on the news. And Nancy Wilson, who was the pastor of Metropolitan Community Church at the time, convened some people to kind of come together for a statewide organization that would be lasting, that would make sure that Anita didn't come to Michigan. And this led to the formation of a group called the Michigan Organization for Human Rights that had its formational meeting in Lansing in October of 1977. So I have talked to the tall one, Don Major, and I've talked to the person to his left, Reddy Scheiberg. The person sniffing the flower is Christopher Flynn, who was one of the first officers of Moore and was also Madonna's dance instructor. And then Sal Connor was from Grand Rapids. The person missing from this photo of early officers was Phil Ojibwe, who I know many of you know from the Senior Coffee Klatch. So this got the ball rolling in terms of kind of pushing for change in Michigan. And Don Major became, you know, the first paid activist, and they opened an office. And he described in the oral history I did with him of going to this organization, this group, this very informal group of professional men called the First Sunday Group that met. They were professional. They could not be out on their jobs or publicly in any way, but they met for social and support once a month. And Don Major described going to this meeting, explaining, giving them the pitch of what Moore wanted to do, and having members of this group that met in Rabbi Wine's home many times, members of this group wrote enough checks to fund them for the first year. The other thing about Moore, I mean, it had a kind of long history. It formerly lasted until 1994, but two of the outgrowths are still with us, one of which is Affirmations Community Center, was initially a Moore program that took its own way, and also the Triangle Foundation, which is now Equality Michigan, had its origins in the Michigan Organization for Human Rights. And probably most other organizations that still exist in Michigan and in Metro Detroit, including Men of Color, the Lesbian Avengers, Black and White Men Together, Fans of Fernwood, a group called Simca, Detroit Women's Coffee House, can all kind of trace their way back. Now, there's a couple other kind of pieces of the puzzle that I want to kind of share before we kind of close out, one of which is the formation of Crossroads, which was one of the earliest organizations that we might now call trans. This is Grace Bacon, who worked at Buick in Flint in the late 70s and started this organization. And this was kind of the earliest. I recently discovered there was also a group nationally in New York that was started called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were both involved in Stonewall, started this group. And I've recently found out that there was a chapter of that in Ann Arbor. That's all I know about it. There's kind of a listing and a possible name of someone involved. That's another thread to chase. But Crossroads kind of helped lay the ground, and Grace is still very much with us, but laid the ground for later kind of trans activism, such as Transgender Michigan. All of that student activism kind of formed the basis of LGBTQ plus student groups at virtually every campus, college campus in Michigan. And then in 1979, Reverend Renee McCoy, who was a student pastor under Reverend Nancy Wilson, and Sylvia Robinson, who was a person working with the Human Rights Department for the city of Detroit, formed a group called the Detroit Coalition of Black Gays. This later became the Detroit Coalition of Black Gays and Lesbians. And this was a flyer for their first meeting, which was to be at the MCC Church when it was on East Adams, where the Central Methodist meets now. And this is a flyer that's in the Jim Toy papers at the University of Michigan. And the piece I love most about this is why, if you have to ask, you need to come. And this was kind of, you know, the legacy of this can be seen in various other African-American organizations, but most particularly in Hotter Than July. And then, of course, the Christopher Street Detroit celebration in '72 can be seen, you know, not only in kind of Motor City Pride, and there's been Pride celebrations of some kind every year since then, not only in Detroit, but around the state. But now we kind of have kind of this flourishing of local prides, not just in Lansing, but in Ypsilanti, in the Mackinac Straits. I love it, Strait Pride, Grosse Pointe, you know, so, and there were two key demands of that '72 march: repeal all anti-gay laws and full civil rights for gay people. And that was a long journey. In 1976, when Elliott Larson was enacted, there was actually an effort to include sexual orientation in the original law, and it got jettisoned. And there were hearings early on, and then under Moore, there were efforts in the early 80s, and then again in the 90s, and on and on. And it took 50 years for this to finally be enacted. And so earlier this year, Elliott Larson was amended to not only include sexual orientation protections, but gender identity protections. And this is Governor Whitmer posing with 7 openly queer members of the legislature. And, you know, historians need to be careful that history is not always, you know, a story of progress, but this is just a lovely place to be, given where we are, you know, with other pieces of the world. So thank you all for being here.
So sorry about the sound. We worked on it for 2 hours. Right now, there are forces in our nation that are determined to undo the work that Dr. RETZLOFF has done. I think you could hear from the talk not only the story of what occurred, but the major gaps that we have in our knowledge, because so much of it was done in closets and in back rooms and in places where they did not record out of fear what they were doing. These efforts that are abroad in our nation right now are determined to make sure that these stories are never heard, that our children have to go through this fear and suffering in ways that their parents and grandparents and their forebears did. And it's our job to make sure, good and damn sure, that they do not. Thank you so much for your contribution to telling these stories. They are so important. Thank you to all of you all that were here with us tonight. I apologize for the technical difficulties. We're usually not set up to do all the sound. I have theories of what happened, but I don't think anyone has wanted to sit here for an hour and wait for me to solve it. So what I will do is we'll get that sound. We'll put a link in our newsletter as soon as possible, and I'll put it in my commentary this week. So, because I had an opportunity as I was preparing all this to listen to them, there were some great quotes there, and I do want you to hear them, and that'll also give a permanent place for us to have those in our own archives. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. What a wonderful turnout for our Pride Shabbat. As always, Joseph Palazzolo, our director of music. My husband Arthur, who usually sits in the back running this thing, to David Weeks for the live streaming. Many hundred or more people were watching this tonight on YouTube, and we have people watching all over the world, hopefully in some places where they can take inspiration from this. Join us for the Oneg Shabbat afterwards in our family room. Thank you to Barbara and Fran for that, and we will conclude now with this beautiful song by another woman in our Jewish world who did not feel safe coming out. Unfortunately, cancer took her life early, but not too early to know the freedom to be with the one that she loved, Debbie Friedman.
Debbie Friedman. May we know peace as we go on our way. May we be guided by love. May we be blessed with health and joy. May this be our blessing. Shalom. If you can stand, please stand. Shalom. Shalom. May this be our blessing. Shalom. 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 May this be our blessing. Shalom. May we be sheltered by the wings of peace. May we abide in safety and in love. May grace and compassion find their way to everyone. May this be our blessing. Shalom. 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 May this be our blessing. Shalom. 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 May this be our blessing. Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and happy Pride.
Shalom.